Bismillāh, ir-Raḥmān, ir-Raḥīm. Welcome back. I'm your host, Rebecca Ann, the Neurospicy Revert. If you've been following my story, you know that when I left Justin, I thought I was walking toward freedom. But the truth is, I was just walking into another kind of storm. Because sometimes the rescue isn't the end of the nightmare. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a different one. After Justin, there was about 4 months of what I thought was freedom, though really it was survival disguised as self-discovery. I didn't know who I was without chaos. I just knew I didn't want to belong to anyone. Then came Chris. He mirrored everything I wanted to hear, and I mistook that echo for love. I didn't know yet that real love doesn't perform, it protects. At first, it felt like redemption, someone finally choosing me without hesitation. But that feeling didn't last long, because when a man like Chris chooses you, it isn't love, it's ownership. Chris was every shade of charming that a broken woman could fall for. He talked like safety, moved like temptation, and looked like redemption. He could talk circles around anyone, but never walk a straight line. He couldn't keep a job, always had an excuse, and always found a reason life was unfair to him. Once, his own mother backed into him with a trailer, and he sued her insurance and won. That was Chris in a nutshell, a man who could turn a stubbed toe into a settlement check. And somehow, in all that chaos, I ended up pregnant. Because the truth, he didn't know what no meant. I got tired of saying, no, not yet, and stop, I'm not here for that. And eventually stopped pushing his hands away as he unbuttoned my pants. So I just laid there, still, silent, detached. And 10 months later, I had a beautiful, strong, and healthy baby boy, Dallas Christian, now Ahmed, and the best thing to ever come from one of the worst seasons of my life. His abuse didn't start with fists, it started with silence, with the way he'd control every movement, every breath, every decision, until I didn't even recognize myself anymore. And by the time Ahmed was born, I wasn't just tired, I was terrified. I tried to leave once. I grabbed a diaper bag, my purse, and whatever courage I had left and walked towards the only exit. Just as I was about to reach the front door, he noticed me from the kitchen, bolted to where I was, and quickly locked it. And when I turned and reached for the phone to call for help, he unplugged it from the wall. So I did the only thing left to do. I shattered the window in the bedroom and climbed out barefoot, glass slicing my feet as I ran down that gravel road with my newborn pressed to my chest, screaming for help that never came. That night should have been the end, but stupid is as stupid does. And in my brokenness, I forgave him. To protect me, or maybe just to control the chaos, my dad allowed Chris to come to the house for a while. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer than being alone with him somewhere else, until it didn't. Weeks after he moved in, the police called and asked Chris to come down to answer some questions. I was waiting in the lobby, confused but calm, and when they came out with him in cuffs, I asked, "What's going on?" One officer said, "He's being arrested for failure to register." And I, naive as ever, "To vote?" He looked at me with this mix of pity and caution and said, "No, ma'am. Sex offender duty to register." I froze. Sex offender? My husband? There was no way. But there was. He'd been hiding it since before we met. A juvenile record that never quite matched his stories. But when you're a girl who's been silenced your entire life, you believe the ones who say they lied on me. He swore the police made him admit to things he didn't do and that they twisted his words, and it was all some setup by an angry mom at their trailer park there in Spring Hill. But when his mother echoed the same story, I believed him. And because by then I knew what it felt like to be lied on, to be guilty because someone else said so. I knew what it was like to be condemned before I was even understood. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt. And it cost me more than I'll ever admit out loud. His mother eventually bailed him out, and the false calm I had enjoyed for a brief moment didn't last even a day before his temper came roaring back. And one evening, my dad heard us arguing, and he actually thought he heard Chris hit me. And when I say all hell broke loose, I mean, Dad came busting through the back door like a soldier home from war and knocked Chris smooth out. I'm talking unconscious in the bathtub, hot water pouring from the spout, and my mom yelling for our neighbor, "David, help!" And as Mom and I tried to pull Dad off of Chris, he wasn't stopping. David just stood there and he said, "No, Butch looks like he's got it." We laugh about that now, but back then, I was torn between gratitude and grief. Grateful my dad finally stepped in, but grieving that it had to come to that point for anyone to protect me. It wasn't long after that when he finally snapped and he hit me hard enough to send me to the hospital with a traumatic brain injury. Once I had my bearings, I pressed charges. Being sent to the hospital like that was absolutely a breaking point for me. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in state jail. And during that time, when he was locked away, I started to rebuild. Sort of. Nate was Chris's best friend, and he wasn't perfect, but he was there. And after years of being told I was the problem, hearing, "I'm sorry he hurt you," felt like oxygen. He came around a lot more after Chris was moved to state jail and started helping with Ahmed. He would call me pretty like it was my name and listened when I talked. I didn't know it then, but I was confusing attention with peace, survival with love. And by the time Chris started writing me from jail, I was already pregnant. Again, this time with Nate's child. And I told myself it was fine. I'd grown up without a father, but I didn't want Ahmed to do the same. But then what about this baby? And what about me? Between the hormones and the wiring from my past, my heart ricocheted between Nate and Chris. Desperate for safety, but drawn to the same kind of storm every time. And after weeks of hearing, "This is what happens when she's not on her medicine," and being stripped down to everything but my name, I started confusing their cruelty for truth. I reached out to my aunt in California, the woman who had lived with a husband and had a not-so-secret lover for years, because I thought she'd get it. And instead of judgment, I got an invitation. "Bring them both out here," she said, "and figure it out. You should get away from your mom. She's too strict anyways." It sounded like freedom. It sounded like everything I'd ever wanted. So I packed up the kids and the chaos and went west. Nate, me, 4 months pregnant, and the kids. Ahmed, not yet 2, Samantha, 2 months younger, and Jasmine, barely 3, on a Greyhound bus, Thanksgiving week, with nothing but a hastily put together plan and enough snacks to last us the ride. And that ride, it was 28 hours of misery. 2 toddlers, a preschooler, swollen ankles, and morning sickness that lasted all day. Every stop felt like a lifetime, and every bathroom break felt like a 10-hour shift at a factory. When we finally got to California, there was a brief second where I thought maybe we'd make it. We visited Hollywood and Venice Beach, drove through Rancho Cucamonga, and walked through stores we couldn't afford just to pretend we belonged. And for the first time in years, I started dreaming again. But peace built on dysfunction always collapses. Nate was growing impatient, restless, jealousy, quietly resentful. And Chris was slipping back into his old self, manipulative, lazy, controlling. And then there was Janet. At first, she was everything she promised: generous, fun, cool aunt energy. We paid her rent, filled the cabinets, kept the house spotless, made sure she wanted for nothing. But what we didn't know was that she was never paying her landlord. She was pocketing our money, forging receipts, and lying to everyone. And by the time the eviction notice came, it was too late. We were broke, homeless, and humiliated. And when I went looking for my father's ring, the only thing I had left of him, it was gone. She had stolen it. Janet wasn't freedom. She was just another version of the manipulation I was raised under, just louder and dressed different. Within weeks, we were out on the street. The state helped with a few nights in a hotel, and my mom and grandmother pulled together enough money to fly me, the kids, and Nate back to Texas. Because we left Chris behind, and honestly, it felt like such a burden had been lifted. Back in Texas, Nate got a job at Trinity Rail Industries as a welder, and all was well until the gas pain I tried to ignore turned out to be full-blown labor. By the time we made it to labor and delivery, I was already 6 centimeters, and because of a previous C-section, they took me straight to the OR. A few hours later, Elizabeth was here. Mother's Day, 2011, and on my biological father's birthday, mercy wrapped in irony. A few weeks later, a fight between Nate and my parents blew everything up. And we ended up in a crack motel with 4 kids, 1 room, and a TV that barely worked. I was spiraling, drowning in postpartum trauma, and I thought money would fix it. So I got a job, a portrait studio gig at the local Walmart. Then I got the call. Chris was missing. It was one of his roommates. She said there had been an argument and he had gotten out of the car and had never made it back home. A few hours later, a hospital called. Arrowhead Regional Medical Center in Colton. "Are you the wife of Chris?" the nurse asked. "Yes." "You need to come. He's been hit by a car, and it's bad. He's been on life support for a while now, and without next of kin, he could possibly be removed from the machines." This was my son's father. How could I not go? So I did. Bought a ticket, one way, and headed back to California. When I got there, I found him broken completely. Left forearm fracture, a femur fracture, a shattered kneecap, internal injuries, and road rash on nearly a third of his body. He had tubes coming out of so many different holes, and after I touched his hand and whispered in his ear, he opened his eyes. He looked at me, and he cried. And I cried too. Not because I missed him, but because I didn't know who I was without chaos. His so-called lesbian roommate, the one who claimed she was helping him out and said she was a friend, seemed so much more. And once he was finally able to speak, Chris swore nothing was going on. And I wanted to believe him. Until I saw the text celebrating their anniversary. I told him I needed some air, and I left the room. I walked around until I found her down in the hospital courtyard. So I sat down next to her, looked her dead in her eyes, and asked, "When were you going to tell me you were fudging my husband?" She froze, stammered something about how he told her we were divorcing and he was getting custody and I was crazy. The usual story a narcissistic abuser would tell. I had her banned from the hospital as I walked back towards Chris. And I walked into the room. A nurse was cleaning the gravel from his wounds. I told her I'd handle it. I was his wife. She had more important things to do. I never said I was going to do it gentle. For weeks, I lived in that hospital, sleeping in his room on a makeshift pallet on the floor, walking miles to a laundromat, eating vending machine snacks, and learning bus routes, just trying to survive. When Chris started showing his ass and refused to work with his physical therapist, the hospital told me I could no longer stay there. No warning, just, "Hey, I know you worked 8 hours and rode 20,000 buses to get here, but we packed up all your things and now you gotta go." Fortunately, one of his nurses, a beautiful soul, took me in for a while in Ontario and until I could get on my feet, which didn't take long. I found a house in Riverside, scraped together a deposit, called Nate and told him I was flying back to Texas to bring him and the kids to the Golden Coast. And for a moment, it looked like life might actually finally settle. I was managing the portrait studio, paying the bills. I was making it work. And then Nate started missing his mommy and began gaslighting me into believing that I was the one missing my family, planting seeds about going home and making it seem like he was concerned and it was out of love when really it was just control. By then, Chris had started spiraling again, looking at porn and blaming my not even 3-year-old for it. So I ended up kicking him out and his wheelchair and all, threw it all out. But then he learned that Nate wanted to go home and I was actually considering it. So he begged me to stay until we left and promised me that whatever money he got from his settlement, he would give it to me. Just don't make me sleep outside. So I agreed, mostly to keep the peace, but also out of survival. I mean, after all, how was I going to pay to move us all back? I had a full house, 2 kids, plus 2 grown men that neither were working. That settlement, that was my escape. Again. New Year's Eve, we packed the U-Haul and left before the bars closed. We drove straight through to Texas. And when we got back, I gave Chris 7 days to find a place to go. His mom's, a friend's, a shelter. I did not care. Just not with me. Not anymore. One day, I came home to find him on my couch with another woman while my children were playing in their rooms. When I told him to leave, then, not later, I became the problem. I was unreasonable, crazy, and abusive. I sent him away with Nate and had Nate drop him off at a friend's house. As soon as he told me where he was, and drove away, I called Crime Stoppers. And a week later, he was arrested. And when that check came in, I cashed it without guilt. Coming back to Texas wasn't freedom. It was pause, the quiet between storms. We stayed in my mother's converted workshop with no running water, a hot plate, a bed on milk crates, and a window unit that wheezed more than it cooled. And at night, I'd lay there listening to the cicadas and the boats on the water and wonder, is this it? Is this the life I was destined to live? I kept managing portraits, smiling for families I envied, and going home to 4 kids and a sink full of bottles. Nate would ask, "What's for dinner?" before he'd even ask, "How was your day?" You see, control doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits for you to break on your own. We slid into the repo world next. East Texas auto recovery with a crook named Wesley. Man, we lived out of that Ford F-350. It had Jared and Hook and diesel in the air, fast food on the dash, and receipts piled high between our feet, like proof we were really trying. I ran VINs and logistics, and Nate hooked the chains and drove. He liked to call me his ride or die, but I think I was just the ride. It was during this season of our relationship that we were on and off like a Walmart clearance light, blinking, broken, and confusing everyone in the aisle. I ended up pregnant again, and between the "I will not be like my mother vows" echoing in my head and the fear that I'd already was, I tried to convince myself this time would be different, that love would finally steady me, and that chaos would not find me again. But at 22 weeks, a pain hit like a knife under my ribs. A cyst had formed on my ovary, and it was twisting around it. And if they couldn't operate immediately, I and the baby could die. They wheeled me into the OR shortly after midnight on December 2nd, 2013. It was my stepdad's birthday, and I remember whispering, "If he's waiting, tell him I'm not ready." I remember waking up later and reaching for my stomach after the surgery, and a kind nurse saying, "She's doing good, Mama. Get some rest." And in that moment, I knew she'd be a warrior. She ended up coming early on April 10th, tiny and stubborn. And oh, when I tell you, her eyes looked like peace in that NICU. But even in the midst of new life and joy, losses just kept coming. My biological father passed in February of 2012, and the regrets I have there, but that's a whole separate episode because there is a lot to unpack. Then my stepdad, the only other man since my grandfather to see me, hear me, and actually try to protect me, passed in 2013. I remember I had told him I was pregnant, and that as much as I wanted him there to watch the baby grow, I knew he was tired, and it was okay to go. Not really believing he would, because when I tell you he was stubborn, he was stubborn. But he did, the very next morning. In 2016, I lost my grandmother, and that was probably one of the hardest losses, because I was once again chasing love in all the wrong places. I was on the East Coast headed home, and my mother called. She said, "Memo's fading, and she's fading fast. You need to come home." I heard her call out for me and the babies, and I cried because I was not going to make it, not in time, and I didn't. Every funeral ripped through me before I healed from the next. And after the emergency surgery and Evie's early birth, Nate and I decided to try again. Why? Because trauma makes you mistake familiarity with love. I kept rebuilding. Nate kept blaming. Until the day he busted Ahmed's lip for talking back. And that's when I stopped apologizing for protecting my children and called 911. I remember when the sheriff and a state trooper came to remove him, I didn't cry. I just watched the lights fade and exhaled. Finally exhaled. You would think I took a break from men, but I didn't. You see, trauma does that. It convinces you that chaos is connection and that pain means passion. There were others after Nate, Curtis and Richard, to name a few. New packaging for old chaos. Curtis wanted control dressed up as care. Richard wanted power disguised as passion. One evening, Richard choked me literally unconscious because I chose a girls' night over him. And that night, something in me finally died. The part that kept hoping love would save me, it was gone. Waking up in that silence, I realized it wasn't peace that scared me all those years. It was peace that felt foreign. People like to say, healing is clean once you find closure, but it isn't. It's messy, quiet, and full of moments where you finally stop justifying why you stayed. That chapter wasn't about love or even survival. It was about seeing the difference between being saved and being controlled. Because the rescue I was waiting for was never coming from a man. It was coming from a law. I just hadn't learned his language yet. With endless dua and gratitude, I'm Rebecca Ann, the Neurospicy Revert. Until next time, stay soft where the world tried to make you hard.